Back in February 2019, I made an unscripted video complaining about No Time to Die being delayed. At the time, No Time to Die was untitled, simply being referred to as Bond 25, and was set for release on the 8th of April 2020. It was previously due to be released on the 14th of February 2020, and these delays were starting to frustrate me. In the video, I made a point that the gaps between Bond films are important, and Bond films shouldn't be released too close to each other, and the gaps also shouldn't be too long. The video itself is a tad outdated, so here, in a scripted setting, I thought I'd go through my thoughts on this topic. When the Eon Bond franchise began in 1962 with Dr. No, a new Bond movie would be released every year, which sounds impossible nowadays. This trend continued until 1966, when for the first time since the series began, a Bond film was not released. From 1965 onwards, a Bond film was released every 2 years, and this worked well, I think. Bond mania was certainly at its peak, but releasing a new installment every year would have soured things quickly. Live and Let Die, Roger Moore's first Bond film, was released in 1973, 2 years after Diamonds Are Forever, thus continuing the new tradition of a Bond film biennially. However, instead of Moore's second Bond film being released in 1975, as one would assume at this stage, it was instead released a year earlier, in 1974. I'm not entirely sure why The Man with the Golden Gun was released just 1 year after Live and Let Die. It did, however, result in a return to the frequency of Bond films in the early Connery era. Due to legal and financial complications, The Spy Who Loved Me was not released for 3 years, the longest gap between Bond films at this point. Perhaps in part due to this hiatus, The Spy Who Loved Me marked a clear improvement after the somewhat underwhelming previous outing, and is regarded by many as one of the best ever Bond films. From 1977 until 1989, a new Bond movie would now be released every 2 years. The fact that Eon were able to keep this level of frequency up for 12 years is fairly interesting to me. It was clearly easier to organise the logistics of making a Bond movie in those days, and they were certainly cheaper as well. Every Bond movie from 1981 to 1989 was directed by John Glenn, so perhaps he was regularly available. From a visual perspective, there is certainly a consistency since the movies during this era, and you definitely tell why that is. License to Kill was released in 1989, and due to varying complicated legal difficulties, which I needn't go into, this was the final Dalton movie, but more crucially, the last Bond movie for 6 years. This is so far the longest gap ever between Bond movies. Interestingly, GoldenEye is regarded as one of the best Bond movies, so whether this prolonged hiatus had anything to do with quality is something to ponder. The gap certainly prevented audiences from becoming bored of Bond, which is perhaps what they were at risk of in 1989 due to the fairly regular schedule. Brosnan's films were all released 2 years apart from each other, except his last, Die Another Day, which was released 3 years after The World Is Not Enough. Why there was an extra year in making the movie is unclear, but the obvious evidence would be that Eon wanted to release Die Another Day in the 40th anniversary year. The film is packed with visual callbacks and similar storyline beats to previous Bond outings. 4 years then passed from Die Another Day to Casino Royale, which rebooted the franchise. This is the sort of phase in which Bond films start to be released on a rather irregular basis. Casino Royale was a huge success, both financially and critically. This resulted in work beginning on a sequel almost immediately. Quantum of Solace was released 2 years later in 2008. It received a rather mixed response, but that's not why the next Bond film took so long. MGM was embroiled in financial difficulties and only exited bankruptcy in December 2010. During this, very little work was done on Bond 23. Production finally began in late 2011, and what evolved into Skyfall was released in October 2012, neatly coinciding with the 50th anniversary of the franchise. The 4-year hiatus here is understandable and doesn't really irritate me at all, and didn't really irritate me at all at the time. Skyfall was also very good, a massive improvement over Quantum of Solace, so perhaps the 4-year gap was worth it. 3 years after Skyfall, Spectre was released. Eon were keen to have Sam Mendes as the Bond director again, so the film could have been released sooner had they decided on a new director. But my issues with Spectre don't have much to do with its direction, but that's for another video. After Spectre, I thought that Bond 25 would be released in 2017. Call me naive, but I thought that 2 years between films was doable. Then I thought that 2018 would be more realistic, and I stand by this. 3 years is perfect. Audiences don't get bombarded by Bond too frequently, so why not? But then, of course, the film had issues to say the least, and was delayed twice before producers finally settled on an April 2020 release date, over 4 years since the release of Spectre. Unlike the 4-year gap between Quantum and Skyfall, this gap seems preventable, And my understanding, and perhaps an incorrect one, is that the producers just sort of dawdled for the first 18 months or so after Spectre was released, alongside trying to get Daniel Craig back on board for one final outing. The gap here isn't because of financial issues, it's just through a rather absent-minded attitude. In this day and age, 2 years between Bond movies is pretty difficult, especially as Bond movies are generally made one at a time, unlike the constant run of Marvel movies. 3 years, on the other hand, completely doable. Making a Bond movie is a logistical nightmare on so many fronts. However, is a Bond movie every 3 years such an impossible task? I'm not suggesting there should be a Bond cinematic universe to the extent of Star Wars, which has been grossly mismanaged due to this obsession with having a new film every year. Bond should always be standalone. A new Bond movie every 3 years seems moderate, not too often, and not too infrequent. Ideal. But how often do you think a new Bond movie should be released? Can a long gap help the franchise if it's ever losing interest? Comment your thoughts down below.